What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be breaking down all of the main card fights from UFC 276. We're going to be taking a deep dive into each of these matchups from a betting point of view, and hopefully you'll be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions and maybe even earn some extra cash. And if you'd like to watch my breakdown videos for all the other fights on this card, all of the prelim matchups, you can find them on my website at MMABettingTips.com. You'll find a link for that in the description below. You can see it in the background here, as well as my breakdowns for all of the prelim fights on this card. You'll also find a wide range of bets for various different types of MMA bets, such as over-unders, props, straight money line bets. Pretty much all of them are profitable over the long term, so head on over to the website and check that out. And you can also join the community, get involved in the discussions around upcoming fights, betting on different sports, betting strategies, that kind of thing, in the VIP chat room. You can find me in there like 8, 9, 10 hours a day, and yeah, I think you'll like it, so check it out. So before we get into breaking down these fights, also just need to let you guys know, this is not financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor, and please remember to gamble responsibly. It is very, very, very difficult to make money betting on any sport. It's extremely difficult. Online, everyone will talk like they're profitable and they're making loads of money. You see these guys on Instagram pretending to be professional gamblers that drive around in Ferraris and have big wads of cash on the table. It is hard, very, very hard. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I can tell you, in order to be profitable on MMA, it literally is a full-time job. I spend all week chained to this desk doing fight research. It's extremely difficult, and pre-fight betting in particular is very, very difficult. I specialize in live betting on MMA, so it's very, very hard. Just know that, and as a result, understand it's very important to do your own research and understand the risks. Don't gamble more than you can afford to lose. With all that being said, I do have a lot of experience betting on MMA. I've been doing it for 15 years. I make a living from betting on MMA, and all the information that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video is coming from many years of experience and a lot of time that I've put into researching these fights. So it's not just me kind of, plucking ideas out of my head from hazy memories of fights that took place a few months ago. Over the last few days, I've been spending many, many hours studying past matchups to be able to, learn how fighters have performed in recent history, to give you guys a pretty good idea of how all these fighters are going to look on Saturday night. So I hope you find that information useful. But gamble responsibly, do your own research, and with that being said, let's get into the first fight that I want to talk about in this video, which is going to be Pedro Munhoz against Sean O'Malley. And every single fight on this main card is so interesting from a betting point of view, and this one is no different. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Sean O'Malley, one of the biggest favourites on the card, at average odds of around 1.33, which is going to be minus 303 for an implied probability of 75%. And if we take a look at the odds on Pedro Munhoz, he's around an average of 3.50, which is going to be plus 250 for an implied probability of 29%. So Sean O'Malley, big favourite in this fight, which is interesting because I also feel this is a big step up in competition for him relative to the guys that he's previously faced. I know Marlon Vera's tough, I know Thomas Almeida's tough, but Pedro Munhoz is the kind of guy that gives everyone a fight. Even when Pedro Munhoz loses a fight decisively, he usually makes his opponent work for it, and he inflicts some damage and turns it into a war. So it's an interesting fight, this, for O'Malley. Let's start off by taking a look at the tail of the tape. Pedro Munhoz is 35 years old, 5'6" with a 65-inch reach, and Sean O'Malley, 27 years old, 5'11" with a 72-inch reach. So there's some really important X factors for us to focus in on here. The first one being the age of these two guys. Pedro Munhoz is going to be 36 years old in September, which is not that far away. And we know that the lighter weight classes, like the bantamweight division that these two are fighting in, tend to be young men divisions. The fighters in the bantamweight division tend to age and decline younger than they do in heavier weight classes, because the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes and athleticism, which tend to be some of the first things that go as you start to get older. So in the heavier weight classes, middleweight, light heavyweight, heavyweight, 35 years old wouldn't be that old at all. But in the bantamweight division, it is. And as a result, you'd expect Pedro Munhoz to be declining quite a lot from fight to fight now, especially because he's had a lot of fights, over 20 pro fights, and because he's been in a lot of wars. We know Pedro Munhoz is the kind of guy that likes to stand and bang and brawl and put himself in danger and force his opponents to exchange. So he's taken a lot of damage in fights. It's a lot of wear and tear on the body, and, you know, Munhoz isn't going to be getting any better at this stage in his career, or at least it's very unlikely. O'Malley, at 27 years old, hasn't even hit his prime yet. He's still very young for a bantamweight, and he should be making big improvements from fight to fight. At 27 years old, that makes O'Malley 8 years younger than Pedro Munhoz, and we know statistically the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight. So even though when you look at O'Malley's odds, they carry an implied probability of 75%, and that, you know, blindly betting off that statistic of the younger fighter winning 67% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight doesn't get you value in these odds on O'Malley. What it does show is that the odds are stacked against Munhoz, and this is just one thing that you can kind of put in Sean O'Malley's column as a reason why he's quite likely to win. Age definitely favouring O'Malley here, but he's also got a big size and reach advantage. At 5'11" with a 72-inch reach, he's obviously going to be a lot taller than Munhoz, which will make it more difficult for Munhoz to get inside and land. But that 7-inch reach advantage is the biggest X factor of them all, because O'Malley knows how to fight long. Sometimes fighters have reach advantages, and it won't make that much difference in the context of certain fights because they maybe don't know how to use it that well. O'Malley is someone that really understands how to use his reach and maximise his length. He's very elusive. He's got great footwork, great movement, really good striking defence. He fights long. He's very good at chipping away at his opponents from a safe distance and landing on them for a range where they have to cover a lot of distance to get anywhere near landing on him. And because his footwork, his movement is so good, he's very elusive. So the size and reach advantage for O'Malley in this fight is going to be massive because he really knows how to make the most of that. But, like I always say, you got to let the odds do the work for you. And if we look at how this fight could go from a stylistic point of view and how these two match up, it's very interesting about this fight is that Sean O'Malley is one of these guys that has been quite fortunate not to face any strong grapplers yet in the UFC. And, you know, I don't want to be disrespectful to O'Malley and say that he's been protected, but sometimes just by the way that the matchmaking works and the way the cards fall, the way certain fighters get matched up with opponents, we know that sometimes fighters can go a really long time without facing certain styles of opponents that are well equipped to exploit big weaknesses that they've had all along. And we just maybe haven't seen much of those weaknesses because they haven't faced the right kind of opponent to exploit those weaknesses. Some really good examples would be a few months ago, we were talking about how Amanda Nunes has had a bad gas tank throughout her entire career. But you don't really see it that often because very few fighters are able to make her work hard enough for her to gas out, because she's either knocking them out quickly, where she's clearly not gassing out, or they're so afraid of being knocked out that they show her tons of respect and don't really make her work, and so you don't see her gas out because she's not exerting that much energy. But then as soon as someone like Juliana Pena comes along, that's tough enough to take her shots and, you know, gritty enough to drag Nunes to the ground and force her to work, we see Nunes' weakness that's existed throughout her entire career exposed, which is her bad gas tank. And of course, last month, I recommended a bet on Taylor Santos to beat Valentina Shevchenko, because even though Shevchenko has been an incredible champion, one of the best female fighters of all time, whenever we've seen Shevchenko on the ground against reasonably skilled grapplers, she hasn't looked great. But if you go back through Shevchenko's record, you can see that she just hasn't fought that many good grapplers. So the fact that she's not great on the ground has kind of flown under the radar throughout her reign as UFC champion. That's why we bet Taylor Santos, and look at how much success Taylor Santos had with her grappling in that fight. She lost a split decision. We got a little bit unlucky with that, and if it hadn't been for the clash of heads, we probably would have hit a giant underdog winner there. But here's what it is. That's why they call it gambling. What's interesting about this fight is Sean O'Malley's kind of in the same position as Amanda Nunes and also Valentina Shevchenko, where it's very possible this guy could be extremely bad on the ground. You know, he talks a lot about how passionate he is about jiu-jitsu, and how, you know, how much he competes at jiu-jitsu and how he's in love with jiu-jitsu. But what we do know is that Pedro Munhoz is a super high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. Very, very high-level black belt. And what we also know is that as a general rule, and there will always be exceptions to this rule, but as a general rule, guys with long, lean, skinny frames, with skinny lower bodies, skinny legs like O'Malley, are usually very easy to take down because they don't have a strong core. They don't have that strength in the lower body to kind of keep fights standing and stuff takedowns when opponents get in deep on their legs and hips and work for a takedown. So we haven't seen very much of O'Malley's, in fact we haven't seen any of O'Malley's takedown offense because no one's really tried to take him down that hard. We haven't seen any of his ground game either. So, you know, maybe he's amazing on the ground, maybe he's very difficult to take down, but I bet he isn't. Usually there's always going to be a trade-off, especially with younger fighters. You know, O'Malley's only 27 years old. And because he is such a good striker, it would be unlikely that he's also a great grappler or have great takedown offense at this stage in his career. I'm not saying he can't develop it in time, but for a 27-year-old, it would be unusual for someone to be excellent at everything at this stage in their career. Of course, there are going to be some outliers like John Jones and you know, Joanna and Jacek was very well rounded at O'Malley's age, but they're rare. They're really rare. And perhaps Sean O'Malley is special. Perhaps he is a unicorn. But when we're betting on MMA, the smartest thing for us to do is go with most likely outcomes. And based on most likely outcomes, O'Malley's grappling is probably nowhere near the level of his striking. And if you look at his record, going right the way back to his UFC debut, you can see he simply hasn't fought any grapplers. Terrion Ware, pure striker. Andre Sukumtar, pure striker. Quinones is actually a decent wrestler, but the fight ended in 2 minutes, so he didn't have a chance to use it. Wineland is a striker. Marlon Vera is a striker. Thomas Almeida is a striker. Chris Patino is a striker. And while Paiva, you know, is a striker, he does occasionally grapple a bit, but again, fight ended very, very quickly, so Paiva didn't really get a chance to get any kind of grappling game going. So O'Malley's been in the UFC for a long time now, but his grappling's a complete unknown, which does give a big path to victory to Pedro Munhoz because, like I say, very high level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and if he gets this fight to the ground, even though we haven't seen a lot of O'Malley on the ground, I would guess O'Malley would be in a lot of trouble here. So the first thing we need to do when kind of trying to predict the probability that Munhoz would be able to use his grappling as a path to victory here is to take a look at how often Munhoz tries to take his opponents down. And I've gone back and watched a lot of Pedro Munhoz's fights, and unfortunately he hardly ever shoots takedowns, hardly ever tries to take his opponents down. Don't think I've ever seen him come in with a grappling heavy game plan. He's more of an opportunistic grappler where if fights go to the ground, he will maybe jump on top of his opponent and try and lock in his signature guillotine, but he never actively tries to get his opponents to the ground. And UFC stats kind of confirm that. If you look at this column here with takedown at the top, TD stands for takedown, it's going to show us how many takedowns Pedro Munhoz got in all of his fights. And as you can see, 0 against Cruz, 0 against Aldro, 0 Rivera, 0 Edgar, 0 Sterling, 0 Garbrandt, 0 Caraway, 0 Johns, 1 against Dodson, 0 Font, 3 against Stasiak, 0 against Scoggins, 1 against Russell Doan, 0, 0, 2 and 0. So as you can see, he occasionally uses grappling, but the vast majority of his fights we don't see any grappling from him. And what I've also noticed is if you look at the fights where he has used grappling and has gone for takedowns, they tend to be pretty early in his career. If you look at the second half of his UFC career, hasn't really gone for any takedowns at all, which is really disappointing. I think there's potentially 2 reasons for this. The first reason being the guys that he's been fighting over the last few years have all been pretty good grapplers, difficult to take down and hold down. Like even guys like Brett Johns and Brian Caraway. Difficult to take down and hold down, right? They're pretty strong grapplers. So that could be one reason why Munhoz has kind of abandoned his grappling in recent years. But another reason could be because it's something that we commonly see in MMA where, you know, when Munhoz first came into the UFC, he was just a BJJ guy. Striking wasn't the best. He was just a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and he wanted to get fights to the ground and use his BJJ because that was his speciality. But then he moved to Florida to train full-time at American Top Team, and then started to develop really good boxing and really nice leg kicks, and kind of fell in love with striking. And since then, we've kind of seen him abandon his grappling and just become a pure striker. And so, for that reason, it's been a really long time since we saw Munhoz implement a grappling-heavy game plan. Now, could he flip the script on us and come in with a grappling-heavy game plan this weekend? Like, of course he could, but based on recent performances, it is quite unlikely. But if you are betting O'Malley this weekend, if you're thinking of throwing him in parlays, something like that, just be aware that if this fight goes to the ground, he's very likely screwed. So it probably isn't a smart idea to be betting O'Malley as a big favourite. So that's one potential path to victory for Munhoz. Another path to victory for Munhoz, we start to talk about how these two guys match up from a striking point of view, are Pedro Munhoz's leg kicks. One of Munhoz's best weapons are heavy, hard leg kicks. Does a really good job of disguising them, and he digs into his opponent's legs so clean and so hard and does so much damage that could really have a big influence on how this fight plays out. We've seen O'Malley injure his legs in two of his fights in the past. Of course, he suffered a leg injury against Marlon Vera, which meant that he couldn't continue. And he also suffered a leg injury in the fight against Andrei Sukumtar, and was very, very lucky that Sukumtar decided to kind of jump on top of him and grind him out from top position instead of making him stand up and strike, because O'Malley had blown his knee out. He couldn't stand up, couldn't put any weight on the leg. So O'Malley potentially is a little bit fragile in the legs. And, you know, we were saying that guys that are kind of lean and skinny, like O'Malley, that don't have a lot of strength in the lower body, usually have quite weak legs. And so with O'Malley potentially being very susceptible to leg injuries, Pedro Munhoz is one of his best weapons is his leg kicks. So that's another big path to victory for Munhoz, and another area that he can cause Sean O'Malley a problem in. Of course, everything that O'Malley does revolves around his footwork. His movement is absolutely excellent. And so that is another way in which Pedro Munhoz can have success in this fight. If he can hurt the legs of O'Malley, if he can beat up the legs of O'Malley, it can affect O'Malley's footwork and movement and mobility, which will also affect his striking defense and his ability to strike effectively. So those are two areas in which Pedro Munhoz could cause Sean O'Malley a lot of trouble in this fight. But if we're focusing on how these two guys match up on the feet, there's no doubt that Sean O'Malley has a big advantage here. He's got the size advantage and the reach advantage, which means Munhoz is going to have to cover a lot of distance to get inside and land. And on top of that, O'Malley is just very difficult to hit anyway. Very elusive, great movement. He does a really good job of reading his opponents. And another thing that O'Malley does really well is that he doesn't panic. No matter how much you pressure him, he doesn't panic and kind of, you know, get overwhelmed by the pressure. And he also doesn't deviate from his game plan and strategy. Sometimes what you see, or quite often what you see, is when you have like a pressure fighter like Munhoz that stalks people around the cage and forces them on the back foot and, you know, forces them to fight in an uncomfortable range, that's really tiring for the person that's counter-striking on the outside, because they're having to exert a lot of energy to constantly react to what their opponent is doing and circle away from them. And a lot of the time what you'll see is their footwork will start to become flatter and they won't have the energy to circle away anymore. So they'll start to plant their feet, stand in the pocket and exchange, which is exactly what a guy like Munhoz wants to do, because he's a boxer. He wants to trade in the pocket. He doesn't want to be fighting O'Malley in a range where O'Malley can chip away at him from a safe distance and use his length. But what I really like O'Malley is he's very disciplined. He's got good fight IQ. He doesn't panic. He sticks to his game plan, sticks to his strategy. He's got a phenomenal gas tank, which means he can continue to circle away from his opponents and pick them off from a safe distance for 15 minutes, no problem. Very, very impressed by how O'Malley reacts to pressure, because a lot of young guys, when they first start to face pressure fighters, they can be broken. And when I talk about pressure, I don't mean the pressure of being a big UFC star or being in big fights, that kind of thing. I mean the act of pressure in terms of combat sports, where Munhoz likes to take control of the centre of the octagon and pressure his opponents into fighting in an uncomfortable range on the outside. But Munhoz is a pressure fighter, O'Malley's a counter striker. O'Malley wants to stay on the outside, play the role of Matador, where he could chip away at Munhoz from the outside, and both guys are going to get what they want here because they're both going to be allowed to fight in that range. So if we summarise all that from a betting point of view, what does it mean? Well, for me, you would have to be crazy to bet on Sean O'Malley this weekend. In order to bet someone in this odds range, where they carry an implied probability of 75%, they have to have pretty much no way to lose, because to get any value on these odds, you've got to cap them at like 80% or better. And we know that O'Malley's never really been tested on the ground, so that's a part of victory for Munhoz. And also we know that O'Malley's potentially susceptible to leg kicks, and Munhoz has got fantastic leg kicks. So, you know, I'm not opposed to betting big favourites. I don't do it very often. Occasionally I will bet big favourites, but in order for me to do it, when I look at the footage and study both guys, there can't be any significant risk factors to the big favourite. Now, of course, you can bet big favourites and lose all the time. I bet big favourites and lose all the time, right? But all you could do is make the best decision possible with the information you've got available. And if you research the fight and there's no big risk factors, you know, go for it. So be it. If there's value there, there's value there, irrespective of the outcome. But in situations like this, where you've got a big favourite like O'Malley, and there are clear and obvious major risk factors to him losing this fight, then, you know, it's just not smart to bet a guy in this odds range. So then the question becomes, if this is a dog or pass fight, is Pedro Munhoz worth a bet? And I have thought a lot about that this week. And while there is no doubt in my mind that Pedro Munhoz does provide the better risk to reward ratio this weekend, I think he's the better bet, right? What I'm having a lot of trouble with, and what I can't get past, the thing that is preventing me from pulling the trigger on Munhoz, is that over the last couple of years, we've seen Munhoz struggle against guys who are nowhere near as good on the feet as Sean O'Malley. And when I make that statement, I'm making that statement based on what is true in 2022. You know, when I say that O'Malley is a much better striker than Dominic Cruz, I'm talking about Dominic Cruz in 2022, not when he was one of the most dominant bantamweight champions of all time. You know, the same goes for Jose Aldo, right? In 2022, not when Jose Aldo was flying kneeing bitches' faces off in the WEC, right? Frankie's a legend. But in 2022, O'Malley is a very good striker. Very good footwork, very good movement, very technical, nice diverse range of attacks. And he's a much better striker, in my opinion, than Cruz, Aldo, Edgar, and Sterling. And so, even though I look at this fight and I go, it's definitely dog or pass, because Munhoz has passed the victory. And, you know, there are ways he can win this fight. What I can't get past is the fact that guys like Cruz, Aldo, and Frankie Edgar have outstruck him from the outside. They've all effectively counter-struck Munhoz. And O'Malley, at this stage in their careers, is a far better counter-striker than Edgar, Aldo, and Cruz. And that is basically the only thing preventing me from pulling the trigger here. Because, you know, with Munhoz's grappling, with the fact he's tough as nails, he's scrappy, he's aggressive, he fights at a high pace, he's got decent power. There's a lot of things to like about Munhoz in this fight. When you're dealing with big underdogs, you don't need to like very much about them to find value in their odds. But value doesn't pay the bills. You know, you can't pay a mortgage with value. Ultimately, you need to win bets and make money. And I do feel that I would be putting my money in a lot of danger if I bet Munhoz, because if, you know, a 36, 37-year-old Dominic Cruz is able to outstrike Munhoz from the outside and do it pretty comfortably. I know he got dropped in round one, but past that, Munhoz didn't really get near him. You know, realistically, how much success is Munhoz going to have on the feet against O'Malley? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm looking forward to finding out this weekend when we see how this one plays out. So yeah, I know Sean O'Malley's popular, he's a fan favourite, but I feel his advantages are mostly baked into the odds, and the odds are probably about where they should be. I wouldn't bet this one if I were you, but if you really, really want to bet it for action, Munhoz is going to give you the far better risk to reward ratio. Now let's talk about the next fight between Bryan Barberena and Robbie Lawler, which is another fantastic fight and a very interesting fight from a betting point of view. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that the average odds available on Bryan Barberena is about 2.0, which is plus 100 for an implied probability of 50%. And if we take a look at the odds on Robbie Lawler, he's around an average of 1.83, which is minus 120 for an implied probability of 55%. So Bryan Barberena is 33 years old, 6 foot tall with a 72-inch reach, and Robbie Lawler is 40 years old, 5 foot 11 with a 74-inch reach. So obviously both guys roughly about the same size here, but there is a big difference in age. Bryan Barberena is going to be 7 years younger than Robbie Lawler, and we know statistically the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there is a 7-year age gap in a fight. But this kind of matchup is the kind of matchup where that statistic is really, really relevant and really important, because at 33 years old, Bryan Barberena is right in his athletic prime for a welterweight. He's the perfect age for a welterweight. Whereas at 40 years old, Robbie Lawler is way past his prime, and we know he's going to be declining significantly from fight to fight. There will always be outliers, guys like Daniel Cormier that, cheat the rules and look great into their 40s, but they're very few and far between, and there aren't many 40-year-olds competing in the UFC for a reason. This is a young man's game, and we know Father Time's undefeated, and we know in the case of Robbie Lawler in particular, he has shown signs of major decline. He looked awful against Neil Magny, awful against Colby Covington, and the most concerning thing for me about Robbie Lawler is that he is showing the one sign that a lot of fighters, when they compete for way longer than they should, start to show. What I'm trying to say is all fighters decline, but some of them continue fighting for longer than they should and continue fighting way past the point at which they should retire. And the one thing that shows that you'll see a lot in these guys that hang around for way too long is when they just can't pull the trigger anymore. When they will kind of stand in front of their opponents and they look the same and they move the same, but they just can't pull the trigger anymore. Anderson Silva is one of the best examples I can think of, where if you think about a prime Anderson Silva, you give him the slightest opening and he's lightning fast. He's going to take it, catch you with something you don't see coming, and knock you out with a shot that, is like something out of the Matrix. But then as Anderson Silva got older, into his late 30s, early 40s, we had these fights where he would kind of just stand in front of his opponent and he wouldn't look any different. He wouldn't move any different, but he just wouldn't throw. He just couldn't pull the trigger. He just didn't have that timing anymore. He didn't have the same reflexes. And when you start to see a fighter demonstrate that sort of behavior, it's over, man. It is over. And that is the exact thing that I see in Robbie Lawler these days. If you go back and watch his fights against Neil Magny and Colby Covington, he's basically just a human punching bag. He just stands there and allows these guys to do whatever they want to him. He doesn't fight back. He just kind of stands there doing like Wing Chun hand movements and moving his head to try and evade shots, but he just isn't firing back, and you can just see the fire's not there anymore. He just doesn't look like he wants to be in there. And so, with Lawler's age, the stage of his career that he's in, you've got to lean towards Bryan Barberena here, because when it comes to Robbie, based on his performances over the last few years, it's unlikely he looks very good. He has become very inconsistent, which is another sign of a fighter on a steep decline. Because when you look at him against Nick Diaz and Ben Askren, he came out very aggressive in both those fights and looked in really good shape physically. There was like a glow about Robbie. He looked ready to go. But then when you look at him in the Neil Magny and Colby Covington fights, he came in softer. he just didn't look that motivated, that hungry. The fire wasn't there anymore, and he didn't try to win, you know, particularly the Neil Magny fight. There were periods in the Neil Magny fight where he just like stayed on his knees for ages and just let Magny do whatever he wanted to him. And this is Robbie Lawler. We know he knows how to work through these positions. And he just totally quit in that fight, waved the white flag, and just didn't look like he wanted to be in there. So from a betting point of view, with Barberena as the slight underdog, I do think he's a good bet. And I don't think Barberena is a good bet because I'm confident he's going to win. Because I'm not confident he's going to win. I don't feel particularly confident in Barberena. Because from a stylistic point of view, a technical point of view, it's not like Barberena has any advantages over Lawler. He's not a better grappler than Lawler. He's not a better striker than Lawler. I mean, we're talking about Robbie Lawler, a former UFC welterweight champion. This guy is incredible. If he shows up and performs with his full potential, Barberena's going to get smoked here. He's in a lot of trouble. But the reason why I feel Barberena is a good bet, and the reason why you've got to lean towards him, is simply because we know he's going to show up and fight to his full potential. The one thing that I love about Bryan Barberena is that he's tough as nails and he's ruthlessly consistent. You know, I always say that we're not betting on robots. We have no idea what version of fighters are going to show up and perform on Saturday night. Fighters are on a continuous journey of self-improvement where they're always going to be learning, tweaking, improving, and showing up with new skills that surprise us, right? Gamrot surprised me last weekend how well his gas tank held up, if you consider how bad it's looked in the past. And every weekend I get surprised by different fighters showing up and looking very different to how they had in the past. But on the opposite end of the scale, fighters can also underperform and decline with age, and performance anxiety can have a negative impact on their performance. And so what I really love about Barberena is when you bet guys like this, you know exactly what you're getting. He is what he is. You know what his striking looks like. You know what his grappling looks like. You know what his strengths and weaknesses are. You know he's got a great gas tank. He's tough as nails. And for 15 minutes, for every single second he's in there, he's going to fight for your money and do his best to win. And ultimately, in a sport that is fraught with risk and very difficult to make money on because of inconsistent performances and the chaos of MMA, having money on a guy like Barberena in a competitive fight is never a bad idea, because you know 100% of the time he's going to show up and perform. He's going to fight his ass off. And sometimes he'll be good enough to win, and sometimes he won't be good enough and he'll lose. But at least he's going to show up and do exactly what you expected him to do. And for that reason, you can't fault him. In the case of Robbie Lawler, we can't say the same for Robbie, because if you go back and watch the Neil Magny and Colby fights, he just kind of didn't look like he wanted to be in there. He just didn't fight. And there will be some people that will be like, oh, how can you say that? Colby and Magny are amazing, and you know, not surprised, whatever. But if you really understand fighting and you go and watch those matchups, some of the things that Lawler was doing in certain positions was the opposite of what he should have done. Almost like he was making conscious decisions to do the wrong thing, to lose on purpose because of some kind of weird self-destructive tendency. And I can't explain that. I don't know why he did that, but it's something that I see a lot of fighters do when they go way past their prime and continue fighting for way longer than they should. So the reason why I find value in Barberena here is because his odds are at an implied probability of 50%, dead even. Now we know that Robbie Lawler's a better striker and grappler. There's no question of that. If Robbie Lawler shows up and performs to his full potential, he's probably going to outstrike Barberena by being the more technical striker, and he could even outgrapple Barberena if he wanted to. However, it's been a long time since Robbie Lawler put in a good performance. Okay, he looked better than he has done in recent years against Nick Diaz, but I think a big part of that was the fact that Diaz was just as shot as he was. And so the reason why I find value in Barberena's odds is because we know Lawler is way past his prime. We know that the younger fighter wins 67% of the time when there's a 7-year age gap in a fight, which will give you a pretty nice 17% margin over the bookie if you're just blindly betting based on that stat. But we also know that 100% of the time Barberena is going to show up and fight his ass off. We don't know what version of Robbie Lawler we're going to get, but what we do know is he's been on a very steep decline, hasn't looked good in many of his recent fights, and we also know that guys aren't going to become motivated and come in better shape and come in healthier as they get older. The older they get, the worse they get, because Father Time is undefeated. And so, seeing how bad Lawler has looked against Colby and Magny means I have to bet Barberena here. Now, do I feel confident in Barberena? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I know that if Lawler isn't really feeling it that night and is not that motivated and is just going to kind of stand there and be a human punching bag, well, Barberena is going to take the fight from him and do everything that he can to win. Because he's going to be hungry, he's going to be motivated, it's the biggest fight of his life, and he's going to bring it, man. We saw that in his last fight against Matt Brown, which was an absolute war. So if I was capping Barberena here, I would cap him at about 60%, which is not a particularly confident pick. It's one of those picks that is barely better than a coin flip, right? I don't feel confident in Barberena, but what I do know is that there's value in his odds. I'm surprised he's not the slight favourite here. If I was capping Barberena, I'd have him as like a 1.70 favourite, which is about minus 125. Maybe a bit steeper than that, actually. Maybe 1.71. But 1.71's fair. Minus 130, sorry, 1.71's fair, minus 141 for an implied probability of in that 60% range. That's why I'd have Barberena, which means we've got a decent amount of value in the odds, betting him at odds of 2.0 plus 100. You're getting about a 10% margin over the bookie if we cap Barberena at 60% correctly. But, if something's got a probability of happening 60% of the time, obviously that isn't that much better than a coin flip. So when you're betting guys like Barberena in spots like this, you're going to lose a lot of these bets, but that's okay, because as long as you win more than you lose over the long run, you're going to grind out a very nice profit. And so for that reason, I think Barberena is a pretty good bet, but understand it is risky. I do not feel confident in Barberena at all, but the value cannot be denied for all the reasons I've just explained. So now let's get into the next fight that I want to talk about in this breakdown video, which is another really interesting matchup between Alex Pereira and Sean Strickland. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Alex Pereira and Strickland are both around dead even money, which is very interesting because 24 hours ago, Strickland was the underdog. We can see that if we take a look at the odds movement chart, Strickland's odds have just started to decline in the last 24 hours, when prior to that, he was around odds of 2.0 around about this time yesterday, which is plus 100. So both guys in that even money odds range, and it's nice to see the odds start to move, actually. I have bet Sean Strickland this weekend. Again, it is a risky gamble. It is a value bet. I'm not going too big on Sean Strickland. But just like with Brian Barberena, I was very, very surprised that Sean Strickland was the underdog in this one. I feel he should be the favourite. And now, again, that's not to say I'm super confident that Strickland is going to win. Not like I favour him massively in this fight. But again, I do cap this fight 60-40 in favour of Strickland, and if I was setting the odds on this fight again, I would have Strickland in this 1.70 minus 143 range, which means betting him at odds of, I think I bet him at 2.0 a few days ago. The implied probability of 50% means we're getting a very nice 8% margin over the bookies, as long as we've capped this fight correctly. And again, whenever you're placing bets on a fighter that you're only really given a 60% chance of winning, you're only slightly leaning towards them, that's the same probability, not too much better probability than a coin flip. So you are going to lose a lot of these bets, but the goal is not to have a high win. Well, the goal is to have a high win rate, but it's probably unrealistic to have a high win rate on risky value bets like this. But the goal is to win a lot more of them over the long term than you lose, and that's how you'll grind out the profits. So enough of the talking, man. Let's actually focus on why I feel Sean Strickland is a pretty good bet in this one. So we'll start off by taking a look at the tail of the tape. Pereira's 34 years old, 6'4" with an 80-inch reach, and Sean Strickland, 31 years old, 6'1" with a 76-inch reach. So straight away we can see both guys are roughly about the same age, but Pereira does have a nice size and reach advantage here, which is pretty huge because Pereira, very high level striker, very good kickboxer. He's going to know how to use that length and maximise that reach advantage. Now, one of the reasons why that size and reach advantage exists is obviously because Pereira is huge, and Strickland used to fight at welterweight, and he's now obviously moved up to the middleweight division. So that size and reach advantage isn't huge, but better to have a size and reach advantage than not to have one. So that's something that's very, very positive for Pereira in this fight. So how do these guys match up from a stylistic point of view, and why do I like Sean Strickland in this matchup? Well, maybe liking Sean Strickland is maybe a strong thing for me to say, but I certainly lean towards him. And one of the main reasons why I lean towards Strickland in this fight is because he has an absolutely massive advantage on the ground. Sean Strickland is a very good grappler, and if Strickland comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he has all the skills necessary to absolutely dominate this fight. And for that reason, he should never have been the underdog. I believe he should be a slight favourite in this fight, because irrespective of how these two guys match up from a striking point of view, we know that if Strickland utilises a grappling heavy game plan, it should be an absolute cakewalk for him. Now, Pereira's not a bad grappler. From what I've seen of Pereira on the ground, the time that he's spending with Glover Teixeira is really paying off, because his takedown offence isn't bad, and his ground game's pretty good as well. You can see he knows how to defend himself on the ground, and he's pretty good at working his way back up to his feet when he does get taken down. Having said that, his takedown offense isn't bulletproof. We've seen both of his opponents in the UFC take him down relatively easily. Both Andreas Michailidis and Bruno Silva were able to get him down. And Sean Strickland is a far better grappler than both those guys. So if Michailidis and Bruno Silva is able to get Pereira down, Sean Strickland can absolutely do the same. There's no doubt about it in my mind. Now, Strickland isn't the best offensive wrestler, right? Strickland is quite flat-footed, quite stiff, doesn't move particularly well. So Strickland's not the best at timing takedown entries. It's not like he's a really good chain wrestler. He doesn't have really nice deep double leg takedown entries or anything like that. But Strickland has got 28 pro fights, trained at Team Quest for a very long time, which is predominantly a grappling-based gym. And Strickland knows how to grapple. If he wants to get this fight to the ground and he really commits hard to his grappling, we know he's got the skills and the gas tank to do it. And on the ground, Strickland, high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, heavy top game, good grappling control, can inflict big damage with nasty, vicious ground and pound. If Strickland comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, Pereira is in a lot of trouble. And with the odds on both these guys being in that even money odds range, that's more than enough reason to start to lean towards Strickland. But every single weekend, we break down fights where one fighter has a clear and obvious path to victory, and for whatever reason they choose not to use it, right? A few weeks ago, we were talking about the fight between Jacqueline Buckley and Albert Duraev, and we said, look, if Duraev comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he's going to cause Buckley big trouble. But we know, for whatever reason, at times Duraev likes to stand and bang. If he does that, he's going to get himself into trouble. What happened? Duraev comes in, stands and bangs, and loses the fight instead of using a grappling heavy game plan. We see fighters make this mistake all the time, and Strickland's the exact kind of guy that will make this mistake. He's crazy, he's wild, he's a lunatic. I love him, but he's absolutely mental, and he is the exact kind of guy that will let his ego get the better of him and go out there to stand and bang and put on a show and try and get that 50 grand win bonus instead of fighting in a way that is going to give him the best chance of winning. The best chance Sean Strickland has of winning this fight this weekend is by using grappling. But the thing is, he's a wild guy. You can't trust him to fight smart. What I will say, though, is that this is a big opportunity for both these guys. It is no coincidence that they're fighting on the main card of a pay-per-view headlined by Israel Adesanya. And it's been pretty clear with how Pereira's been fast-tracked into this fight that the winner of this is probably going to be fighting next for the title. So there's a big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for the winner of this fight. They're going to get a title shot against Israel Adesanya. And so, in the past when we've seen Sean Strickland standing and banging against guys like Brendan Allen and Jack Marshman and Uriah Hall, I can kind of understand it because, to be honest, he was kind of nobody in the middleweight division back when he was walking Jack Marshman down and screaming at Marshman to stand and bang. He was not ranked, he was not popular, casual fans had never really heard of him, and so Sean Strickland needed to think of a way to raise his profile in the UFC and get people talking about him. You know, after the long layoff between the Taleb and Marshman fight, he's only won, 5 fights in a row. There's plenty of guys in the UFC that go 5 fights in a row without getting a title shot. But Strickland has been thrown into the limelight because of his popularity and his crazy personality. That means, in my opinion, that even though Strickland doesn't use grappling heavy game plans that often, even against opponents like Hall and Brendan Allen and Jack Marshman, where he probably should have, he was probably not using grappling heavy game plans against those guys because it was part of his plan to increase his popularity in the UFC, because he understood he needed to do that in order to make more money and get title shots. It's exactly like when Colby first came into the UFC and he was very respectful and humble, and then he realized that he needed to create this crazy character in order to get people talking about him. What that means in the context of this fight is that Sean Strickland is very close to achieving his goals. Mission accomplished is just around the corner for Strickland. If he can beat Pereira, if he can just get past one more opponent, he's achieved his goals of getting that title shot. And so if ever there were a time when Strickland would come into a fight with a grappling heavy game plan, you have to feel it would be this weekend. Because in the past fights when he didn't grapple, he's focused on increasing his popularity, making more money, getting those bonus checks. But he's done all that now. And now he can see the light at the end of the tunnel, that title shot. So will he continue to be this crazy, reckless guy that likes to stand and bang? Or will he come in this weekend, fight smart, do what he needs to do to win, and put him in line for a title shot? I don't know. I really don't know. But the point I'm trying to make is Strickland's been reluctant to use his grappling in recent years, but we know he's a good grappler. If ever there was a time to grapple, it would be now. You understand what I'm saying? So that's another reason to kind of lean towards Strickland in this one. Now, in terms of how these two guys match up from a striking point of view, I don't think the skill gap is as big as a lot of people think it is. I do think Pereira has an advantage on the feet, but I don't think it's a particularly big advantage. I think both these guys are completely different styles of striker, and if this were in glory, if this were a kickboxing match, I'm sure that Pereira would do terrible things to Sean Strickland and probably knock him out. But this isn't a kickboxing match, it's an MMA contest, and MMA striking is very different. The distance, the range, even the cage is completely different, and we've seen lots of guys come from traditional kickboxing backgrounds and really struggle to adapt to MMA striking, and if they do adapt, it takes them a long time. Think about guys like Joe Schilling and Gokhan Saki and Jairzinho Rosenstrike. They just haven't really been able to take their high-level kickboxing and adapt it to high-level striking. Now, there are certain outliers like Stephen Thompson and Israel Adesanya, but it generally takes guys a long time to develop that kind of MMA striking from a traditional kickboxing background, and I still think Pereira's got a lot of work to do. He's very dangerous on the feet. He's very fast, he's very explosive, he's got a lot of power, and he throws a nice diverse range of attacks. But he is more of a sniper. He is more of a single shot striker. He doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes, and he doesn't react well to being pressured either. Strickland's obviously the complete opposite, because Strickland does throw a high volume of strikes, but Strickland's not particularly powerful or dangerous. He looks to break you down with volume and pressure. Now, what's interesting about these two is neither of them react particularly well to pressure, and again, what I mean by that is, not the pressure of fighting on the main card of a big UFC event. I'm talking about pressure in the octagon, when one guy is coming forward and forcing them to engage and kind of react to what they're doing and putting them on the back foot. Strickland is a pressure fighter. That's what he loves to do. So when guys flip the script on him and pressure Strickland, he just doesn't look comfortable. And Pereira doesn't look comfortable at all. Pereira looks really awkward actually when guys walk him down, and his defense isn't great when they do that. This is quite significant because Pereira is not a pressure fighter, but Strickland is, which does give Strickland some opportunities on the feet. The problem with this matchup for Strickland is that Pereira is very dangerous. And if you do walk a guy like Pereira down and you do pressure him, you kind of poke the bear and force him to fight in an uncomfortable range, at the end of the day he's going to plant his feet and fire back. He might not like what's coming back in your direction because he's very, very, very dangerous. But what I will say about Strickland is that he is deceptively good defensively. When you look at Strickland and his stance and his style of striking, if you just watch a couple minutes of him, you wouldn't think he would have very good striking defense because he stands flat-footed, chin up high, hands down low, and he's quite stiff and rigid. He doesn't move particularly well. If you actually watch decent periods of his striking, you'll see that he's excellent at reading his opponents. I think Strickland is such a crazy guy that he loves to fight so much. He's so comfortable in the chaos. He loves to scrap. And because he is so crazy, it's like he's very calm in the octagon. It's like he's at peace. And because of that, he's very loose and very relaxed, and he can read his opponents very well and see everything coming. So he's very good at rolling with the punches, staying just outside of a range where he can be hit, and using his elbows and his arms and his hands to deflect shots. Very impressed by Strickland's striking defense, because to the naked eye, you wouldn't think it would be that good. And his record kind of backs this up. He's had 28 pro fights, and if you look at his record, he's only ever been knocked out one time in 28 pro fights, which is really, really impressive. So I do give Pereira the slight advantage on the feet, because while Strickland will likely outland Pereira, remember that impact and damage are primary scoring criteria in MMA, and I feel Pereira's shots that he's going to land on the feet are going to be far more damaging and far more impactful. But ultimately, if you go back and watch the fight against Bruno Silva, Pereira won the fight. He did outstrike Silva. There's no doubt about that. But he didn't completely smoke Silva. He didn't blow him out the water. It wasn't like Pereira was absolutely styling on Bruno Silva. The stand-up exchanges were, maybe competitive's not the right word, but Silva hung in there with him, and landed some good shots. And I just think that Strickland is so much better than Bruno Silva is. If Silva can have a little bit of success on the feet, Strickland can go many, many steps further than that. So the reason why I like Strickland this weekend, and I think he's a good value bet, and I lean towards him, is simply because he has a huge advantage on the ground, and we know if he comes into fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he's likely to dominate. And while Pereira does have an advantage on the feet, I do think it's likely to be close and competitive. And hell, with the way MMA judges are at the moment, even if Strickland loses the fight, judges might fucking score the fight for him anyway, right? So I would cap Strickland at 60% in this matchup. I think he should be the slight favourite, because while Pereira does have a slight edge on the feet, that does not come close to the giant advantage that Strickland has on the ground. But it's a very risky bet, and I don't feel that confident in Strickland, because capping him at 60% is barely better than a coin flip, right? This is one of those volume bets that you place a lot of over a long period of time, and over a long period of time you end up making more than you lose by getting your money in strong positions where the odds are off. Strickland should be a slight favourite here, purely based on his advantages on the ground. For that reason, I think he's a good value bet, but I don't feel at all confident in him. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we will see what happens this weekend. So anyway, now let's take a look at the co-main event, and I get deja vu researching this fight. It's the third time I've researched this matchup. Obviously, the third time that Volkanovski and Holloway have met. The first time, obviously, Volkanovski was quite dominant, won the fight pretty clear. The second time was much more competitive, much closer. Most people had Holloway winning the fight. We can pull up MMA decisions right now. If we go to Holloway, we can see that most people scored the fight for Max Holloway, myself included. I actually watched the fight again today. So you can see most people scored the second fight for Holloway, and I scored the first 3 rounds for Holloway, and then the final 2 rounds for Volkanovski, which I think is what most people with eyeballs scored the fight. So how do I see this third fight playing out? Well, let's start off by taking a look at the odds, because remember, we're not trying to focus on who's more likely to win here. We're focusing on who is the better bet, who's going to give you better value for money. And we can see that Volkanovski is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.53, which is minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. Then if we take a look at the odds on Max, he's around an average of 2.75, which is plus 175 for an implied probability of 36%. So Volkanovski is 33 years old, 5'6" with a 71.5-inch reach, and Holloway 30 years old, 5'11" with a 69-inch reach. So a few X factors for us to dig into here. I do think both these guys are getting pretty old for featherweight. We've already said that the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes, and athleticism, which are some of the first things to go as you start to get older. And Volkanovski is going to be 34 years old in September, which is quite old for a featherweight. Holloway is only 30 years old. However, he's got a lot of miles on the clock. You know, if you look at Volk, he's got 25 pro fights. Holloway's got 29. Not a massive difference in fights, but there is a massive difference in the level of competition both these guys have fought. Holloway came into the UFC in his early 20s. He was in a lot of wars, took a lot of damage. Holloway's got a lot of miles on the clock compared to someone like Volkanovski that came into the UFC far later in his career, and so didn't put as much wear and tear on his body when he was facing guys that were a much lower level, you know, outside of the UFC, that couldn't really, you know, damage him as much as the guys that he's going to be, you know, experiencing when he fights in the UFC. So straight away you look at this matchup and, you know, they're no spring chickens, man. They're starting to get old, but obviously, you know, they're both at similar stages in their career, I would say, so it's probably not going to have a massive impact on this matchup. Now, obviously, we've already seen these guys fight twice, which is a really good resource for trying to predict who's more likely to win this one and who is likely to be the better bet. And what I can say is that I do think there's a good chance both these guys have got a lot better since they last fought. You know, we've seen Volkanovski absolutely systematically destroy Brian Ortega and Korean Zombie. And we've seen Holloway put in an extremely impressive performance against Calvin Kattar, and he looked decent against Yair Rodriguez too. If I'm being totally honest though, I do think Holloway's incredible performance against Calvin Kattar had a lot to do with some weaknesses in Kattar's skill set. And I do feel that Volkanovski has improved a lot more than Holloway has since their last fight, which you wouldn't expect because Volkanovski's older, but then Holloway has got a lot more miles on the clock, so I guess he's more likely to plateau sooner than Volkanovski is. So I think Volk's got quite a bit better than they last fought, whereas Holloway, I'm not sure he's improved too much. I think he's still mostly the same guy. Now, in terms of grappling, I think it's a bit of a waste of time for us to talk about grappling in this fight. You know, we can talk about who has the advantage on the ground, but ultimately these guys have fought twice before. They've been in the octagon for 25 minutes together, and neither of them has been able to get the other down and hold them down. Sure, Volk has landed a few takedowns here and there, but every time he takes Holloway down, Holloway immediately pops back up to his feet. So I don't think grappling is something we should focus on too much here, because based on how their first two fights played out, it's very likely to be a stand-up fight. And in a stand-up fight, this one's very interesting. If we're looking at this one from a pure probability betting point of view, common sense would tell us that there's value on Holloway. The reason why I say that is because Holloway is the underdog. Odds are around 2.65 plus 165. Those odds carry an implied probability of 38%. Now, when they last fought, it went to a razor close split decision. And obviously in a split decision, it's 50-50 who's going to win, right? Either this guy's going to get the decision, this guy's going to get the decision. But most people scored that fight for Holloway. I scored it for Holloway. I think he won the first 3 rounds. And most people had Holloway winning that fight. It was a pretty bad decision, if we're being brutally honest. For that reason, when you see odds of 2.65 plus 165 on Holloway, you've kind of started to got to feel like there's value there. Because if we know, based on their last fight, that again, this is likely to be super competitive and be a 50-50 fight, there's value there, because Holloway's odds don't reflect an implied probability of 50%. They reflect an implied probability of 38%, which if the probability of Holloway winning this is 50-50, well then you've got a nice 12% margin over the bookie based on these odds. So common sense would tell us Holloway is going to give you the better risk to reward ratio here. Why would you want to bet on Alexander Volkanovski as a 1.53 favourite for an implied probability of minus 189 Sorry, money line odds are minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. When you know, based on the last fight, the probability of him winning is probably 50%. So it doesn't make any sense to bet him at odds that reflect an implied probability of 65%. You're just giving up. You're getting no value there. That's a minus EV bet. What's interesting about this fight, though, is that I do feel the longer Volk spends in the octagon with Holloway, the more he is working him out. If you go back and watch their first two fights, Holloway made life very easy for Volkanovski in the first fight. Because what happened is, very early into the first fight, Holloway was coming forward, standing heavy on his lead leg, and Volkanovski was blasting the outside lead leg of Holloway with those devastating leg kicks, really digging his shin bone into the calf of Holloway. And very early on into that fight, because Holloway kind of didn't address the leg kicks, just let Volkanovski do it, Holloway was impaired very early into that fight. He was forced to switch stances. He couldn't move particularly well, which affected his boxing and, made it, I'm not saying an easy fight for Volkanovski, but I think the leg kicks caught Holloway by surprise. And so Holloway already had a very big mountain to climb in that matchup because of the damage he sustained to his lead leg. So Volk takes the first fight very, very comfortably. Going into the second fight, Holloway does a really good job of reading the leg kicks of Volkanovski. And so Volkanovski's not able to land many leg kicks early. It's now a boxing match, and Volk's not able to use those leg kicks to affect the mobility of Holloway and slow him down. And what you see in the first 3 rounds of that fight is Volkanovski really struggling to get inside the length and reach of Holloway. I know that Holloway has a 2-inch shorter reach than Volkanovski, but Holloway's taller and he fights very long. So with Volkanovski being the smaller man, he was struggling to cover that distance and get inside, and Holloway was chipping away at him and outstriking him relatively comfortably. In the first 3 rounds of the fight, particularly the first 2 rounds of their most recent fight, Volk couldn't really get near Holloway and land anything too significant. But then into the 3rd round, and then more so the 4th and the 5th, Volkanovski started to get inside quite easily and land big, hard power shots on Holloway, and started to inflict a good amount of damage on Holloway and started to outstrike him. And I think this was a sign that Volkanovski was, or had, basically worked Holloway out. He didn't have to work him out in their first fight, because he hurt him with those leg kicks very early on. And so by the time Holloway had made an adjustment to those leg kicks, he was already badly hurt and already having to fight in a stance he wasn't comfortable in. And so Volkanovski wasn't getting the best version of Holloway because he was impaired by the damage to his legs. And that's how Volkanovski looked great on the feet and was very comfortable against Holloway in their first fight. Then in the second fight, Volkanovski couldn't use those leg kicks to affect the mobility of Holloway. So right from the very first second of their second fight, he's dealing with the best version of Holloway. And we know Holloway is an absolute elite striker. So it's no surprise that Volkanovski struggled to deal with that. And, it took him a few rounds to adjust and, find his range and settle into a rhythm and start to work Holloway out. But when he did eventually work Holloway out, he outstruck Holloway, convincingly. He was landing cleaner, harder shots, had the volume, he was having tons of success, man. Now, it was a bad decision because it took Volkanovski really until the 4th round to really get going and figure Holloway out. But my concern for Holloway in this fight is that now Volkanovski's had those 25 minutes in the second matchup to experience the best version of Holloway. He's going to be able to start much faster in this 3rd fight and have a lot of success from round 1 as opposed to kind of waiting until round 4 to get going. Because when you look at Holloway's performances, against Keita and Rodriguez, the 2 fights since, He fought Volkanovski for a second time. He does look amazing against Rodriguez and Keita, but he also looks the same as he always has looked. It's just Rodriguez and Keita weren't capable of dealing with that style. We've seen Volkanovski deal with that style pretty well in both fights. And so, if Volkanovski has really worked Holloway out here, I think we could see a really dominant performance from him. Because if these 5 rounds look like the 4th and 5th round of their last fight, where Volkanovski doesn't have to have that period to work Holloway out and find his range anymore, then I think he could be pretty dominant. So, when it comes to betting this fight, it's a really tricky one for me. Because in my head, I've got the devil on this shoulder, the angel on this shoulder, right? And the devil is saying to me, don't be a dickhead, don't overthink things, let the odds do the work for you and bet Holloway. Because their last fight was super competitive. Holloway won on most people's scorecards. Is likely to be super competitive again, which means both guys have got roughly a 50-50 chance of winning. You're an idiot if you don't bet Holloway at underdog odds because the value's there. So that's what the devil is like this on my shoulder. Or maybe the angel. Maybe that's the angel, right? Telling me not to overthink things. Think rationally and let the odds do the work for me and just fire off a value bet on Holloway. But then the devil or the angel, depending on your perspective, on my other shoulder is going, but why did Volkanovski do so much better in the 4th and 5th round of their last fight than he did in the 1st, 2nd and 3rd? It's not because Holloway's getting tired and slowing down. Holloway's a cardio machine. I'm sure Holloway was more tired than he was early in the fight, but Volkanovski would have been as well, so it should kind of balance out. And we know Holloway's the kind of guy that gets better as fights wear on. And on top of that, we know that, these guys fight at a pretty slow pace anyway. Not against everyone, but against each other the fight is quite slow paced. Because it's like a chess match. You're not seeing both these guys go to war like Gamrot and Tazrukian, or Keita and Emmett. This is a chess match, man, where it's a game of inches. They're going shot for shot. Not like they're in there brawling, exerting tons of energy. So their gas tanks are going to hold up pretty well. So the devil or the angel on this shoulder is going, Volkanovski finished the last fight strong. That's probably a sign that he'd worked Holloway out. So if he starts the fight strong this time around, could be pretty one-sided. So from a betting point of view, I don't know what I'm doing on this one yet. Obviously, I've got some value bets on this card that I don't feel confident in. But I am really confident that there's good value on Barberena and Strickland. I know this from how both guys match up with their opponents. Doesn't mean they'll win, but it does mean there's value there. There's no doubt in my mind about that. When it comes to this fight, when it comes to capping fights and working out what probability both guys have got of winning, we're all guessing. We're trying to make the best decision possible with the information we've got available. And how much money you make in this game is all down to your ability to interpret information correctly, or as correctly as possible. If you look at this fight through a really simplified lens, there's value on Holloway and you have to bet him. But that nagging doubt in my mind is, why did Holloway struggle so much in the 4th and 5th against Volk? It's probably because Volk found his range and started to work him out. And so unless Holloway's coming into this 3rd fight with new tricks up his sleeve, with new ways to kind of throw Volkanovski off and cause him trouble, this could be really dominant for Volk. Now, I haven't made my mind up on whether I'm betting this one yet. I know that I won't be betting Volkanovski. There's no way I would bet Volkanovski, just for the same reason I'm not going to be betting O'Malley, right? It just doesn't make sense. I love Alexander Volkanovski. He's an incredible fighter. He's one of the best featherweights of all time. But it would be foolish to bet him at odds of 1.53 minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%, when we know their last fight was 50-50. It would be very foolish to bet Volkanovski this weekend. That's a minus EV bet. But got those nagging doubts about Holloway. So in my mind, this is definitely a dog or pass fight. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Question is whether I want to bet the underdog, and I haven't made my mind up yet. I need to give this one some more thought. Let me know what you think. Let me know. Is Holloway a decent bet? Let me know what you guys think. Drop a comment below. So now we get into talking about the main event this week, which is going to be Jared Cannonier against Israel Adesanya. And we've talked a lot about these fights in this breakdown video, some really complex matchups. And these main event fights are usually very complex. They take me a lot of time to break down, but I don't think this one's going to, because I would say this is probably the least interesting main event we've had from a betting perspective in quite some time, which is absolutely fine, because the rest of the card is incredible. And don't forget, if you like these breakdown videos, check out my website, MMABettingTips.com, where I'll have breakdown videos for all the prelim fights on this card. Check it out, link in the description below. But yeah, man, this fight between Cannonier and Israel Adesanya isn't that interesting from a betting point of view, because both these guys are strikers, and one of them is a far better striker than the other. Obviously, I'm talking about Izzy. If we look at the odds, Izzy is a big favourite. You know, one of the biggest favourites on the card at average odds of about 1.24, which is going to be minus 417 for an implied probability of 81%. And if we take a look at the odds on Cannonier, he is around an average of 4.50, which is going to be plus 350 for an implied probability of 22%. So Jared Cannonier is 38 years old, 5'11", with a 77.5-inch reach. Israel Adesanya, 32 years old, 6'4", with an 80-inch reach. So obviously some pretty notable X factors in favour of Izzy there. The first one being the age. He is 6 years younger than Cannonier. We know that the younger fighter wins around 65% of the time when there's a 6-year age gap in a fight. But again, like with Barberena and Lawler, these guys are at the stage in their careers where that statistic is super relevant, because Cannonier is in his late 30s, that stage in his career where he'll start to decline rapidly. We know Father Time is undefeated, and in the case of Cannonier, we've seen signs of decline in him already. He hasn't looked that sharp in his last couple of fights against Derek Brunson and Kelvin Gastelum. He's just not as physically imposing. He doesn't move as well. He doesn't have the same pop in his shots. He's just not as sharp. His movement's not as good. So we're definitely starting to see declines in Cannonier, and the older he gets, you know, the steeper that downward trajectory will become, and he'll start to decline more and more from fight to fight. On the other hand, Israel Adesanya at 32 years old is pretty young for a middleweight, and so Izzy should still be making big improvements from fight to fight. So both these guys are at that sweet spot for that statistic where it's really relevant, and Izzy being 6 years younger gives him a big advantage in this matchup. He's also got a size and reach advantage. Cannonier is quite short for a middleweight, and you can see Izzy has got a 2.5-inch reach advantage. But just like with Sean O'Malley on this card, Izzy is someone that fights long, knows how to fight long, knows how to use any little reach advantage he's got. He's an absolute technician, and so any reach advantage, any size advantage for Izzy is a huge bonus, because he knows exactly what to do with it. So in terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, if we focus on grappling, I don't think we should waste any time talking about grappling. Both these guys are primarily strikers. Neither guy ever tries to take their opponent down. I don't recall either of these guys ever shooting a takedown. Both of them have their weakness on the ground, but because neither of them are particularly good offensive wrestlers, and they're both reasonably difficult to take down, you know, even if one of these guys gets hurt and goes into panic mode and starts to grapple, I don't think there's any chance this fight goes to the ground. I think this is going to be a stand-up contest. And in a stand-up fight, Izzy's got a huge advantage. He's younger, he's bigger, he's taller, he fights longer. At this stage in their careers, he's more durable. He throws a higher volume of strikes, a more diverse range of strikes. He's the total package. Izzy has just about every advantage you could want in an MMA fight. And what I notice about Jared Cannonier is, you know, he's just not as sharp as he used to be. A little bit flat-footed. You know, doesn't have the same pop in his shots. Doesn't move as well. Reflexes aren't quite what they used to be. And he's also a very, orthodox boxer. Very blue-collar, gritty striker. but there's nothing flashy or special about Cannonier. He really is just a boxer. Like, he's got some decent kicks, but for the most part, he wants to stand in front of you in boxing range and box. He's a very basic striker. He does the basics very well, but there's nothing special about his style of striking. And obviously, Izzy is a master of striking, an absolute technician. He's seen guys like Cannonier 1,000 times before, and he's going to be able to work Cannonier out pretty quickly, get a read on him, find his timing, find his range, start to pick Cannonier apart. So this is one of those fights where Izzy has just about every advantage you could possibly want, and aside from like a flash KO, you know, a big punch landing and knocking Izzy out, I don't really give Cannonier much of a chance here. He does hit hard, he's tough as nails, and you know, there's absolutely no quitting him, but with how good Izzy is defensively, it's pretty unlikely that Cannonier is going to be able to match the volume that Izzy's going to put on him or land a big shot to knock Izzy out. And for that reason, I think Izzy's going to win this fight a really high percentage of the time. The problem is, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, because Izzy's a big favourite for a reason, and his advantages are largely baked into the odds. Now, is this a dog or pass fight? Probably not. Usually in spots like this, just due to the chaos of MMA, I would lean more towards the underdog for giving you the better risk to reward ratio. But because Cannonier's path to victory is so narrow, I wouldn't want to put any money on this guy. And if you really must best this matchup, you gotta go with Izzy, right? Maybe find a prop to make him more interesting, but at these odds, I would just pass on this one. So I hope you found this breakdown video useful. Thank you very much for watching. Hit the like button if you appreciated this video, and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment, let me know what your bets are for this weekend. Good luck to all of you. I hope you do great this weekend. I hope you make some money. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I will see you next week. Cheers.